lost my thought, I lost this, that's what. But sometimes they can also just put two things. They can cause confusion by means of the imagination. They can cause what dealing with them. So the broad ways of discerning them and that type of thing. The spiritual warfare is so intense, it is a blessing from God on a certain level that we don't really see it all. And that's one of the things exorcists will very often talk about, is the fact that you come up against certain things which you realize just how intense the whole process actually is. Saints talk of seeing the demonic and their activity being so thick in the world that it would constitute a black cloud which is everywhere. The demons cannot act directly upon the soul or upon the higher faculties of the soul, that is the intellect and will, the possible intellect, it's the immaterial side of our intellect. But the angels can act upon our bodies. And when Adam and Eve ate the apple, that was a bodily action that resulted in our bodies being subjugated to Satan. Angels can act upon the body, St. Thomas says, by causing local motion. So in other words, they actually move the body in a particular way. And they move the different faculties in us in different ways. There's one of the ways that they move, this is through our memory. So they can move our memory, because it's it's good body order. How we know that? You smack a guy over the head and he forgets what he is, right? So, but angels can act upon the memory. Now that's an important point to remember, because that means that every time you commit some sin, it gets stored in your memory, and it means it becomes material for them to tempt you later with. This is one of the reasons why you just, stay away from anything that violates the Sixth Commandment. Stay away from anything that's going to, that could possibly lead you to sin in the future. They can then act upon your imagination, and that's where they principally operate, is in your imagination. But St. Thomas is very clear in saying that they can't create things in your imagination that you haven't already seen or heard or something of that sort. They can take parts of it, they can chop them up into bits and pieces, so like we can. Like you can take a mountain, imagine gold, and you can take the gold in the mountain, imagine a gold mountain. Okay, well they can kind of do that with us, but you have to have at least the gold of the mountain. They can't create the image of the mountain in your imagination without you having at least had it before. He gives the example of the demons can't make a blind man imagine color, for example, unless he's already seen color in the past. They also act on what's this is the common sense power. That's the power that unifies all our sense experiences, and there's an actual function that the common sense power plays. So it unifies all my sense experience. So when you see me talking and you hear and see me talking at the same time. There's people who actually have a dysfunction in the brain where they see and hear people at different times. I can't remember the name of the particular problem. But this common sense power is also used to focus on a particular thing. It's called inattentional blindness. It's a necessary mechanism. So like, for instance, if a man is at war and he's told, okay, you make sure that this thing keeps getting loaded every time he goes off. Well, he can't be worrying about the bullets flying over his head, thinking about that when he's got to be focusing on that. Okay, he does that by means of that particular faculty. Then the next one is they can also move the locomotive, the locomotive faculty, which is the one by which we move ourselves. They can move our faculty of speech. The nutritive faculty, what we eat, that type of thing, they can affect that. The other power that they can affect, which is something that's quite important, is called the cogitative power, and that's the power that has the capacity to make associations. So what demons can actually do is they can put an image in your imagination and then move the cogitative power to look at it from a particular point of view. Now, why? And so that we and make it particular kinds of associations. Why is that so important? Well, it basically comes down to this. We have these emotions, right? And St. Thomas makes a distinction between what he calls antecedent and consequent passion. Antecedent emotion or passion is the things that occur before we even have a chance to think about it, like when you get angry without having even thought about it, or contrary to what you want or will. But then there's those which follow upon reason. So if someone comes up to me and says, "Father, hey, nice casket, Father." I'm like, "Oh, well, thank you." And then later I get to thinking about, wait a minute, he was, being mean. Then I get angry, right? Well, that's because the emotion follows reason, so it's antecedent. The way you train antecedent appetite is by either confirming it or denying it. And you also, as you grow in virtue, the antecedent appetite will begin to wane. You'll have less of it. Our Lord and Our Lady did not have antecedent appetite. Adam and Eve before the fall did not have it. After the fall, it's a product of the fall, okay? Well, what can happen is that they can actually now, our emotions are moved by what's in our imagination. You don't like the particular emotion you want, get your mind off it and get it on something else. But what the demons can actually do is put an image in your imagination, put the perspective that will elicit the emotion of anger or sadness or rage or whatever in your imagination. And they can move the cognitive power to do this. This is extremely important in marriage. Because one of the biggest problems in marriage is the wife will do something perfectly right and harmless, and the husband will look at it, the demons come in, move the cognitive power to look at it from a particular point of view, and the next thing you know, he's all angry about it. It's like, what's up with that? Well, and that tells you something, You have to be really careful because they're right in the middle of those kinds of things to try and cause disharmony. So that they can move these various faculties in us. But the faculties that are purely spiritual, part of which is the intellect and our will, they cannot affect. Demons can also cause certain kinds of, actually it can cause every form of mental illness there is. Every form. That doesn't mean everybody who's mentally ill is demonically influenced. There's some people that are authentically mentally ill. One time I got a phone call from the Chancery when I was in Omaha, and they said, this woman thinks she's possessed. Would you see her? I said, yeah. So I set up an appointment. Her husband called me and said, she's not possessed. She's just nuts. That was why my response. I'm like, okay, I got to take this with a grain of salt because she could actually be possessed. And she says, no. She says, she'll turn the dryer on, and the hose in the back of it moves from the exhaust, and she thinks it's possessed. Just ignore her. And then I found out later that someone's playing tricks on her and stuff, so. Okay, so, and she was just, she tried to call me 16 times in one day. That's a bit over the top. So, some people are legitimately mentally ill with no connection to demonic influence. But a lot of people aren't. A lot of people are mentally ill because of demonic influence. And very often you can get rid of demonic influence underneath the influence of somebody who's perfectly normal. They don't need any further counseling. They need nothing. They just need to be liberated. Angels can cause in us, they can cause us to hallucinate. The good angels do the opposite, though. So, in other words, what the bad angels do to us, the good angels can do to us as well. You can ask your guardian angel, help me to remember this. I do that all the time at Mass. Inevitably, at the consecration, if something comes up at Mass about, oh, you need to look at this, you need to look at that, you need to look at this, and so then I'll just tell my guardian angel to remind me of that later, and then I can zone out, I don't have to worry about it. But that's one of the things that is important, so they can help you remember, they can help you have the right kinds of images, help me to form the right images, help me to look at this in the right point of view. But the angels can do something that demons do not do. Angels can actually act upon this immaterial part of our intellect and illumine us, make us more intelligent, and they give us, so they can introduce an image into our imagination, then strengthen our intellect to be able to look at that image and see it as something that we may not have seen before, or to understand it to a greater degree. The demons never do that. They'll introduce stuff into your imagination. They may even give you certain kinds of knowledge, but they'll never illuminate you because they don't want you coming to knowledge of the truth, and that's what illumination does. It gives you knowledge of the truth, and they don't want that. Even if it serves their end, they just don't want it. Demons are able to present an image in such a way that one is likely to judge it falsely, which will affect the judgment of the individual. In other words, they can compromise your judgment very easily. In fact, that's very often what you'll see with people who are demonically influenced. You get them out from underneath the influence, and they're just like, why was I thinking that? It doesn't make any sense at all. Demons can cause confusion by means of the imagination. They can cause what one friend of mine calls brain scramble. They just get in there and they just cause the confusion. They just first like, I lost my thought, I lost this, that's what. But sometimes they can also just put two things that are contradictory together. That's the definition of confusion. Two things that are contradictory in one thing. And so they'll very often do that. On the other hand, God permitting, an angel can move the faculties which are maybe ill-disposed to a better disposition. In other words, just as the demons can actually start breaking down the biological function of the brain and drive a person to mental insanity, so the good angels can actually do the opposite, God permitting. So in other words, they begin to arrange the matter in your mind better so you have better clarity. And that's one of the things that will very often happen. is that people come out from underneath the demonic influence, all of a sudden they have this intellectual clarity they didn't have before. And it doesn't mean if your brain is in a fog that you're under demonic influence. It just means that sometimes happens. Angels, both good and bad, can also act upon the senses themselves. Sometimes people will feel being touched when there's no one there and that type of thing. The angels, both good and bad, God permitting, can also offer the senses a sensible object formed from without, which occurs either by nature or by the action of the angel himself. So in other words, they can make, like some particular thing form in front of them. They can move matter together and it makes it look like my husband, not mine, but someone else's. That's because I've heard women actually have that experience. The angels and demons can also move the nutritive power. They can make someone feel hungry. They can cause indigestion and things of this sort. They can cause a person's stomach to churn. They can transport things inside of an individual. And so during certain possession cases, just this volume coming out of the individual exceeds his weight. You're like, how did that happen? And it's usually not very appealing substances, apparently. Angels cannot cause us to sin. They can't act on our will and make us sin. The devil made me do it. He can affect your. He can actually affect your. He can affect your imagination, and then from that you fall into sin through temptation. But that's not the extent of it as far as their ability to make you commit any sin. There are two kinds of diabolic activity, ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary diabolic activity consists essentially in two forms of activity by demons, namely temptations and snares. Father de Laporte observes that external objects, and above all persons under his influence, the demon makes use of these as instruments to bring together a concurrence of circumstances which suddenly seize upon the unwary Christian and cast him into the abyss. An obstinate hunter, Satan knows how to foresee and await. So in other words, let me give you an example of this type of thing. When I was writing my book on psychology, when I actually came to the chapter on demonic, which took us a significant amount of time to actually research, I had everything ready to go, computer's on, and go to sit down, and the phone rings. And mind you, I was in a directory where the phone might ring twice a week for 20 minutes. It just kept ringing. So I finally said to them, I'm not answering the phone. Boom, it stopped. So the point being is that they can actually move other people through stuff that's completely harmless. They'll remind somebody, I should talk to Father so-and-so about this. So the next thing you know, the phone's ringing, and you're bugging Father type of thing. Not that you should think that every time you talk to Father, you're bugging him. Although some of the priests might feel that at times. But the point is that you can do stuff that's appear completely harmless, and there's no sin on your fault, but they can do these kinds of things to get to other people. And that's something to kind of keep in mind in marriage, too. Then there is, of course, regular temptations where they introduce stuff into your imagination. Now, when you are created, the angels can look at the material disposition of your matter, your genetic code, and they can tell a significant amount just by looking at your matter. They can tell what your disposition is, whether you're sanguine, choleric, that type of thing, whether you're going to be prone to anger, whether you're going to be prone to sins against the Sixth Commandment, whether you're going to be prone towards other kinds of sins, disobedience and things of that sort, because you're unruly in your lower nature, because there's certain dispositions for that. And that's one of the reasons they can tell a significant amount. They can just look at our matter and get a read on it and say, this person has this particular vice and this virtue. Because why? The body adjusts itself to the operations of the soul. It means that when you perform actions, good actions, your body begins to adjust itself so it can perform that good action. When you do bad actions, your body begins to adjust itself so that it can accommodate that. Even though the body isn't designed for that, as it begins to accommodate, it starts breaking down. So sin basically breaks your body down. You actually see that in certain people that are really vicious people, for lack of a better word. You can actually see it on their countenance. You're just like, man, these guys have a rough life, morally. All right. So, whereas you go to a convent, you find some nun who's extremely sanctified and mortified herself, and she doesn't even have to open her eyes, and there's just kind of this glow, this countenance that you see. And so that is a sign of the body adjusts itself to the operations of the soul. The demons look at that and they can see. Now that gets to the point about whether they can read your mind or not. There are certain aspects of what they can't see. God can block them from actually looking at it. But we know through modern science that there are certain physiological reactions when people perform certain kinds of actions. When you lie, your eyes, around your eyes, it heats up a bit. So demons can actually see that and he's lying. So there's certain times they can know what you're thinking. Now there's another way they can know what you're thinking, is if they're causing it. They can introduce something into your imagination and kind of hold it there. And they can tell whether it's getting pulled one way or another by whether you confirm it or deny it. And so that's another way they can actually know. So they can introduce something into your imagination and then tell you. That's actually happened to me. This one woman was possessed. This is just by way of example. It happens numerous times. For me, all the weird, esoteric, strange stuff you see in movies, which is actually mild, is not the real stuff. The stuff that's most jarring to me is when they can introduce something into your imagination and tell you. So there was this one woman who was possessed, and during the exorcism, they introduced into my imagination, which they'll do very often, they'll do it very subtly. This one's just not, she's not possessed, right? And as soon as they did that, out of her mouth came, "You think I'm nuts, don't you?" So they'll do that kind of thing. That's one of the signs that they can actually do that kind of thing. Okay. So not every time that they move our faculties, it's necessarily trying to tempt you to sin. It can be to bother other people and things of that sort. Not every temptation is from the devil either. All temptations come from the world, the flesh, of the devil. So not everything is demonic. I tell everybody, Satan's not under every rock. He's under every other rock, but he's not under every rock. And even if you lift up a rock and you put it back down, you go back later, and there he is, even when he wasn't there before. I mean, so the point being, he's not always. And that's something that moderation really has to be maintained in dealing with these things to make sure that you understand where the cause of something's coming from. Because sometimes people will try to blame it on demons when, no, it's just because of your past sinful history. Okay, so that's the ordinary diabolic activity. Then there's what's called extraordinary diabolic activity. That goes above and beyond what is normal diabolic influence, which all men must endure. Everybody has to deal. Everybody, save one person, was excluded from demonic temptation, Our Lady. She's the only one who's ever been excluded. That's one of the reasons why she was so mystifying to them. And it comes under the title of Mother Inviolate. Not only was she not violated in relationship to the Sixth Commandment, she was not violated even by temptation. But, even, and you'll hear exorcists, oh yeah, she was tempted, but that's just bad theology, and it's not from anything that they really know as exorcists, it's just bad theology. But even Christ allowed himself to be tempted, even though he wouldn't have had to if he didn't want to. But he did for specific reasons. So everybody has to deal with the ordinary diabolic activity, everybody. But not everybody has to deal with the extraordinary. And there's 6 kinds of extraordinary diabolic activity. The first is external pain. And basically this means the demons beat up on people. So, you hear about this with St. Paul of the Cross, Akira Bars, St. Padre Pio, those particular individuals actually were beat up by demons. These forms of diabolic activity do not require an exorcist. There's basically nothing you can do. It really just requires the prayers on the side of the individual being beat up on. That's why God allows it, and that's the only thing that's going to stop it usually. Once in a while, though, if someone is possessed or some other kind of influence the priest can block the person from actually coming under that kind of diabolic attack. I don't know if any of you saw the Exorcism of Emily Rose. It's actually based on a true story. I have a friend of mine who actually knows the priest that did the exorcism. He failed to do one thing, and that kind of where she was, afflicted. He failed to bind the demons from harming her. It's a common thing that happens among inexperienced exorcists. And even among experienced exorcists, the demons can suppress his memory so he can't remember to do a specific thing, and then in the process of the exorcism, things start going strange. This is why his dependence on grace is so important. This is also a reason why very often they'll tell people that are assisting him, or even the individual that's possessed, you make sure you tell me to do this if I don't forget it. The next is diabolic or demonic possession. This consists in Satan or demons taking full possession of the body and not the soul. They can't possess the soul. In these cases, the demons speak and act through the body of the possessed without the knowledge or consent of the victim, which is morally without guilt for the things that occur while he's under the possession. Now, when I say fully, what that means is that it gives them access to the whole body. It doesn't mean they actually have full possession of the body. If they do have full possession, it's called perfect possession. It's exceedingly rare. I've never seen it. I've never known any exorcist who's ever seen it. Usually what they'll do is they'll possess parts of the body, like behind the left ear or behind the right ear or in the stomach or something like that, especially if it's done by something they drank. So, for instance, I know a gentleman who became possessed by drinking unblessed wine. Now, the next time you don't think it's necessary to bless your food, I think again. Not that I think you're all going to be possessed or that you are necessarily. But the point being is that there was a curse placed on the wine, and when you drank the wine, boom, you became possessed. And possession is in the midsection where the wine is absorbed. So they normally possess a part or parts. If there's more than one, they'll possess more than one part. The signs of possession are an ability to speak with some facility in a strange tongue. Very often you'll see that in mental institutions of speaking languages they've never even heard before. Or to understand it when spoken by another. The faculty of divulging future hidden events. And by future, there's some indication, not because it's something that's contingent, that we can't predict, but something that can be predicted. Or hidden events, something going on in the other room that we just don't know. Display of powers which are beyond the subject's age and natural condition. For example, an 80-pound boy lifting 3 men that weigh, collectively 500 pounds type of thing. And various other indications we've taken together as a whole pile up the evidence. The more experienced the exorcist, the more you can pin it down as to whether it's possession, or something like that. The basic signs of possession point to some agency which goes beyond the natural capacities of the individual. It's usually something beyond what the individual has a capacity for. Not always. Sometimes it's something that they'll do things that have to do, it's beyond the natural capacities, or it's something which human beings just simply are incapable of doing, such as changing shapes, changing colors, things of that sort. But sometimes the signs are much more subtle. And the more subtle they are, the more experienced the exorcist needs to be able to ferret them out. One of the subtle signs of possession is extreme disassociation. No, what disassociation is, it's a natural mechanism which God built into human beings in order to protect them from extreme psychological damage. And basically what it is when a person undergoes a traumatic event or a series of minor traumatic events, what happens is the person begins to disconnect from reality and see himself, viewing himself kind of experiencing this thing going on. And so as a person becomes more disassociated, they become less connected to reality. Very often they'll be around people, they just can't, like, people talk, they can't quite hear, they can't focus on them, and that type of thing. Lack of focus is very often a sign of disassociation. The demons can induce that because it's principally a function of our body, that disassociation. And it happens very commonly among women who are raped. And so that disassociation is the thing that opens the door very often to demonic influence. It's a natural mechanism, but if it's induced unnaturally, that's what opens the door, and that's what rape does, that's what traumatic offense does, that's what abusing children does very often. But when they get older, they're very disassociated. It doesn't mean everybody who's disassociated is demonically influenced, but very often they are. There is no such thing as multiple personality disorder. It's all ruse. And the reason being is because people can feign different personalities, but a personality is constituted by the collective habits, dispositions, and choices of an individual, which means there's only one personality. Now, that doesn't mean that in certain instances a guy might kind of change how he behaves, but there's not more than one personality. And very often, people who are possessed are just labeled as multiple personality disorder. Some people who are labeled multiple personality disorder are simply liars, and extreme cases of it. But there's actually none. And if you want to find out why that's the case more, you can read my book, which, if you can get to the stage where you can understand that part of it, you're doing pretty good. There are multiple personalities in people through possession, obviously. Okay, so possession, that's what possession is. And possession as a variety is so multifaceted. It's so incredibly multifaceted. It doesn't matter how long you've been doing exorcism as a priest. I guarantee you'll always come across something that you've never seen before. And exorcists have actually created an association in order to be able to pool their knowledge and ask, have you seen this, have you seen this? In this case, what do you do? Because even guys who've been doing it for 17, even 40 years in length have to talk to other guys to find out if they've ever seen this. Okay. The next is diabolic obsession. The symptoms include sudden attacks, at times ongoing, of obsessive thoughts. In other words, the person just can't get something out of their mind. Sometimes it's even irrationally absurd, but of such a nature that the victim is unable to free himself. In other words, he can't think outside that box. When it happens to him, he just can't think differently. Therefore, the obsessed person lives in a perpetual state of prostration, desperation, and attempts, sometimes even at suicide. Almost always obsession influences dreams. There's certain questions as an exorcist you can ask about people's dreaming patterns, and that can very often tell you whether they're obsessed. Some people will say that this is evidence of mental illness requiring the service of a psychiatrist or a psychologist. The same could be said of all forms of demonic phenomena. That's what they often say. Some symptoms, however, are so inconsistent with known illnesses that they point with certainty to evil origins. Only an expert and well-trained eye can sometimes identify the crucial differences. Certain forms of modern psychology, however, are inherently inadequate in relationship to these certain kinds of causes. Well, let me give you an example. There has not been a single solitary individual who has come to me that's been diagnosed as bipolar that's on meds that I haven't been able to get completely off their meds and straightened out in 3 months if they do certain things. Not one. And that is something that tells me. Now, there has been people that haven't gotten straightened out with us because they didn't do what I told them to do. But what that's a sign of is in fact that bipolar is actually a form of obsession, demonic obsession, by the time it gets to the point where it's diagnosable. And basically it's because a person's leading contradiction. There's some kind of contradiction in a person's life. It's going like this. The contradiction just keeps driving their psychology to more extremes. And eventually comes a point where the demons insert themselves in the process and it becomes really extreme. It's called manic and depressive stages. And the person has no control over it. Well, usually that can be broken fairly quickly. Usually they're off their meds in 3 weeks. They're usually normal, straightened out, feel normal after about 2 to 3 months. What does this mean? Every form of mental illness can be caused by demons. Not everyone is. And sometimes you can't, to be able to distinguish them is extremely hard. But there are certain patterns that you see as an exorcist that tell you whether something is in fact psychological or demonic. The psychological, if it's truly psychological, it will either be physiologically based or it will be triggered by certain objects or events. If it's demonic, it will have no correspondence to anything whatsoever. So the person all of a sudden will just wake up one morning, they're fine, all of a sudden, boom, they're just like, oh, I'm all depressed. They have this feeling of heaviness. They can't, and sometimes too, one of the things that's been unfortunate, and this is one of the signs that bishops really don't know what they're doing. They'll say, well, I'm not going to give faculties for exorcism until the person's investigated by a physical doctor, he's by a psychiatrist or psychologist, and then they go down a list of 40, 50 people before the guy even gets to the point where they, well, maybe it is diabolic. A good exorcist can usually decide someone pretty quickly and determine, no, this is just, there's a blessing he can give. Usually after giving that blessing, within 2 to 3 days, he can make the diagnosis if he's good at it. If the person's obsessed demonically, after he receives this blessing, he'll feel a sense of freedom, usually shortly after the blessing or even during it, a sense of freedom from symptoms for about 2 to 3 days, and then it comes back. That's the pattern. That's one of the clear signs it's diabolic. When you exercise them or give them a blessing, this is the pattern. When you're getting them cleaned up, the pattern starts, it's still doing this. And then what will happen is that you'll give them the blessing and then it kind of pans out for about 2 to 3 days and then it starts doing this again. And then you do it again and then it starts slowly getting better and as time goes on it gets to the point where it starts panning out if it looks fine. But then there's usually 2 dips, usually 2, 1 to 3, where it'll be going along finals and whoo, all of a sudden the symptoms get really bad again. You get the blessing and they're back up. And then usually after about 2 to 3 months, they're in the clear. They just have to make sure they do certain things, stay away from certain things, and they won't have any more problems. That's one of the signs that you know it's diabolic. Because if it's physiologically based, the blessing won't do anything. And that's one of the things that, in fact, quite frankly, it's more economical just to send a guy to an exorcist. And I'm not saying every person who has mental problems should immediately go to an exorcist. That's not what I'm saying. Because exorcists don't have time for that kind of thing. But at the same time, there's clear indications. And one of the signs that psychiatry very often is inadequate or not enough is the fact that they go to counselor for years, and they don't get any better. In fact, usually they get worse. And one of the signs, too, and this is one of the real dangers to going to a psychiatrist who gives you meds. Okay, it might stabilize you, but then what happens is because the demons are driving it, it's very slow spiral down. Person seems like they're functioning okay, but if you watch them closely over the course of time, they're slowly spiraling down because the meds will only block it to a certain degree. It can only mask certain symptoms. It's not going to take away the cause because the cause isn't physiologically based. Certain forms, this diabolic obsession is, even though it's considered extraordinary, it's very common. In all of my discussions with other exorcists, our experience is that, and this is going to sound high, and I admit that everybody always says, oh, exorcists, they see Satan everywhere. I would be willing to place a wager that 25% of the adult populace in this country is diabolically obsessed, usually with the relationships with matters that pertain to chastity. Especially if pornography is involved. Pornography is one of the most stubborn ones to break. So, and this is something that you see, it's very common. Women, as I mentioned, have been left raped. There's a very high percentage that are influenced. The next is called diabolic oppression. This is manifest in symptoms from very serious to very mild illnesses. Oppression affects one's health, employment, relationships, and the symptoms include unexplainable rages, and even a tendency to complete isolation from people around you. You know, some people, I knew a woman once who made the mistake of allowing people to pray over her by imposing their hands. She became diabolically oppressed, and her life imploded, literally imploded overnight. And I'm going to be talking about why you don't do that kind of thing later, and why it caused it. And why certain aspects of charismatic renewal have to be avoided. But that stuff we'll talk about in a little bit. Job, in the book of Job, is a clear example of this kind of demonic influence. It can result in physical illness, which cannot be cured by medical means. I know of a case of a woman who was sterile for 11 years of their marriage. She was exorcised, conceived the next month. It can affect relationships. For example, when unexplainable, there is a falling out among family members. It can also affect people's employment. For example, when they're fired suddenly without any reason, or why is the boss always going off on me when I'm not doing anything? That type of thing. Then there is diabolic infestation. This occurs when things outside of man, that is the malefic, that is the bad activities directed towards places such as houses, office, stores, fields, objects, cars, pillows, mattresses, dolls, and animals, and therefore indirectly affects will indirectly affect man. A friend of mine actually had bought this house. I told him don't buy the house because I knew his wife would be happier out in the country, but he bought the house anyway. 2 weeks later, his wife was unhappy. But anyway, that's not the point of the story. They bought the house, and about 2 months after they asked me to come bless the house, and every time I'd go into the house, I'd get physically ill. Until I wore the relatively true cross, and I could go in, I could get in the house, it didn't bother me. I thought there's something in the house. And then they asked me to bless the house, and when they first moved there, they had a dog, and it immediately started becoming ill. And so after I blessed the house, I blessed the dog. The dog started convulsing a bit after I blessed it. The next day it was fine. So I said to him, you have a demon of illness in the house. So we exorcised the house. It took me a year to get that thing out. Not after his wife contracted cancer. After that, after even we got the demonic influence released, she still had the physiological effects of the cancer, and she eventually died from it. So this is something that's very serious, you know. And as witchcraft becomes more and more prevalent, which is one of the principal ways by which they open the doors, witchcraft becomes more prevalent. This is one of the problems. This is why I tell people, make sure you find out who you buy the house from. So, then there's diabolic subjugation or dependence. That's the last one. This is when people voluntarily submit to or place themselves under Satan, for example, by a blood pact with the devil, or by consecration to the devil, or by doing certain acts of witchcraft to empower themselves. It's always done for power, usually. People want it for power. So how do you fall prey to these 6 ways of becoming influenced? The first is by God's permission. In fact, no demonic activity can occur without God's permission. Since God is able to allow anyone to fall prey in this way, it should not be assumed that if one does fall prey, it is necessarily because of something he has done. As a result, falling prey to this kind of demonic activity is not a sign of someone's state of soul. God sets the entire rules for the engagement of it. So what does this mean? It means that people can become possessed through no fault of their own. I know people like that. They haven't done anything wrong yet. They became possessed. God allowed it because he wanted certain things to occur. Sometimes people are targeted. I know a particular individual who was targeted because of a particular grace that they had. This person is possessed, and we're going on the 5th month, trying to get it straightened out. There are, which that actually brings up a particular interesting point, which I'll probably discuss a little bit later. But it can be through no fault of their own. Usually it's because people do something evil, but that it can be through no fault of their own. But it's all because God allows it, and usually allows it because there's something that he wants accomplished. The possession or any kind of demonic influence whatsoever is entirely determined by God, not only to the degree of the possession, the degree of the influence, but even how they're influenced, what they can do. One of the things that you do in exorcism is you try and beat out a demon. What was the cause? In case there's something that you can undo to undo the cause, to break the possession. What's your name? What rank you in? When are you going to leave? What sign is there? And the reason being is the demons know the cause. They know when they're leaving. They know very often with the exorcist. I have a case right now where the possession was the demons were telling me things through her before she even met me. It's only later that we began to discover that this was, it's only much later we discovered that they were actually not talking to her, they were talking to me. So they can actually know who the exorcist is going to be, they know when they're going to get booted out, how it's going to be done, etc. So this is something that is, God determines the rules of engagement, and they can't do things outside of that. God won't let them do it. The second is by being subject to an evil spell or curse. A curse or spell is the intention of harming others through demonic intervention. In these cases, the person again is not culpable for falling prey, since it is done by another person using the demons. This is why things such as witchcraft, sorcery, spells, bindings, evil eyes, and maledictions are so dangerous. And by maledictions, we mean even when parents curse their children. I know a gentleman who's possessed now because his father cursed him. This has become very problematic in the last 40 years, and particularly in the last 10 years with the rise of witchcraft among teenagers and feminists. It's become a serious problem, especially among teenage girls who are kind of getting involved in it because it's kind of a fad in certain places. There is sometimes a distinction made between two kinds of witchcraft, white witchcraft and dark witchcraft, and even that is distinguished in two distinctions. What does that mean? Well, it means this. There's a distinction that says, well, there's white witchcraft, which is actually just, where you fake things. You do this magic, and you fake, making the ball disappear, when in point of fact, all it did was go down into the table, etc. And that type of magic is perfectly acceptable. I mean, it has a legitimate entertainment value, and there's nothing wrong with it as long as somebody doesn't intend anything disordered by it. But then that's distinguished from black magic, which is trying to get demons involved in order to achieve something. That is distinct from another distinction which is made, you'll very often hear between which witches. They'll say I'm a white witch, which means I use witchcraft in order to achieve good things. That's not how it works. And whereas a black witch is one who does evil things. That's just not how it works. Anytime you make use of incantations and things like that to bring something about and say, well, this is power of nature. No, it's not. Nature doesn't have the capacity to do these things. If it did, it would be part of physical laws and we'd be able to figure it out and do it. It doesn't do that. Rather, this is a case of somebody performing some type of act of witchcraft, and then as a result, hoping, like, I want to make my boyfriend fall in love with me, so they do this little thing that, little Miss Wicca over here has told them to do, and so they do this. And very often it ends up with people having a possessed or with all sorts of physical problems and that type of thing. And in point of fact, it's just bad. The church has always systematically condemned that, even for good intentions. Another way that people can become demonically influenced is by a great and hardened state of sin. For example, sexual perversions, violence, drug use, abortion. Abortion is a very common one. Women who've had abortions very often are obsessed. And one of the things that's common to see, not always, is that when a woman has an abortion, if she becomes demonically influenced, that will affect the subsequent children in the womb. This is one of the reasons why I just literally will scream at a priest if he tells me that you don't have to do the exorcisms of children. He needs to be slapped, taken out, and beaten silly. Because I've seen child after child brought to me because of the fact that the priests skipped the exorcisms in the baptisms. And two children become possessed in the womb by witchcraft and other things. It can also be caused by things such as homosexuality. Homosexuality is actually rooted in a disassociation. It's a part of the text that I'm writing right now. But it's rooted in a disassociation. And very often it can't be broken unless there's certain things done. Living in irregular marriages, committing violent actions, superstitious practices, indirect invocations of the demonic, and hypnotism. These are just to name a few. With the increase in abortions and the collapse of married life, many souls are being afflicted. Other cases which authors mention are balls, now called discotheques. That was in the 70s. But certain kinds of dancing and that type of thing can bring people under that influence. And not all balls. I mean, by balls we mean, like there can be legitimate where they do certain forms of ballroom dancing, which can be graceful and actually teach modesty, etc. There's nothing wrong with that. But here they're talking about dancing that's disordered. Modern forms of music, very common. Very, very common. Jordan Allman remarks in a quote already given that a person may come under the power of the devil by reason of a habitual practice of evil, or, and here's the big one, an uncontrolled desire to experience extraordinary mystical phenomenon or to receive charismatic graces. Now that is extremely important. A charismatic grace there's a specific Latin term, but it basically means it's a gratuitous gift given by the Holy Ghost. You cannot ask for charismatic graces and receive them. They are not subject to merit. You can't ask for them and get them. All you can do is dispose yourself if God wants to give you one, fine. And they do exist, but they're extremely rare. So this is something that's very important. To seek something supernatural in a disordered fashion is called superstition, and that's what a large segment of the charismatic renewal is founded on. Not all, but a lot of it. And so I have seen countless people who have become under demonic influence from charismatic practices, one of which is in the position of hands. Now, the priest can impose his hands because they've been anointed. They're sacramentals. That's why they can be venerated by kissing them. And so when he imposes it on, if the demons are there, it drives them nuts and they want to get out. If it's a layman, well, they haven't been anointed, you want to stick forks on your head. It's going to have the same effect. It's a superstitious practice for a layman to impose hands on somebody. And this is one of the reasons why people become demonically influenced as a result. That not everybody does, but some people do. I've known people who become oppressed, obsessed, the whole bit as a result of it. In these cases, the beginning part of the remedy is clear. So when people have, when they have a grave part in the life of sin, it's clear. One has to have a conversion in life and go to confession regularly. In fact, confession is one of the most powerful things, even from the person who's possessed through no fault of their own. If they go to confession regularly, that really has a weakening effect on the demons. All sexually perverted activity, homosexuality, violence, drug use, abortion, violent actions, and superstitious practice, and direct invocations of demons have to cease, period. And by superstitious practice, I mean intentional or unintentional. It has to stop. Why is that important? Harry Potter. The books of Harry Potter were written with actual spells in them. There was a woman, in fact, in Spain, and you might have seen it on the internet, there was a woman in Spain who decided she was going to try and see if this spell by fire would actually work. So she said the spell in front of her house to her. The other thing is, too, and this is something that an exorcist told me, which I didn't discover on my own, this is something he discovered, that the actual names, not all of them, but the actual names in Harry Potter are names of demons that have been exorcised from people. Keep it away from your children, period. I know an exorcist who has exorcised 3 children who became possessed as a result of just reading it. Stay away from it. Now, you'll hear from time to time priests even some exorcism. There's nothing wrong with it. Don't listen to them. I'm telling you that from experience from other experienced exorcists. Those living in irregular marriages must either get them regularized or repudiate the marriage. Parents must also keep watch over the kinds of music to which their children listen. This applies to not only to satanic forms, but also those which affect people's appetites by increasing their appetites. What does that mean? If people get some emotional buzz out of it, it has to be tempered. Because if it's not tempered, then what happens is it becomes kind of an addiction. How do you know that? Well, how do you know that that it's an addiction? Well, it's easy. Tell the person to stop listening to it, and usually they're like, I don't want to stop listening to it. The broad signs of demonic. Okay, now here's some of the broader signs. You can kind of see that, okay, something's wrong here. The first is the spirit of falsity. The devil is the father of lies, but he cleverly conceals his deceit by half-truths and pseudo-mystical phenomena. So if a person is just lying to you all the time, morbid curiosity. This is characteristic of those who eagerly seek out the esoteric aspects of mystical phenomena or have a fascination with the cult of preternatural. Apparition chasing is a serious problem. The minute people hear, Bessie Sue Kerfufflewitz has had a vision of Our Lady, everyone piles over there to get the latest scoop. Wait until the church makes a judgment before you put any stock in that. Okay. And that's something that people have to be careful about. Confusion, anxiety, and deep depression. Depression is one of the clear signs of obsession. Obstinacy, in other words, the person just refuses to do something. This is one of the surest signs of a diabolic spirit. Constant indiscretion and a restless spirit. People walk, pace back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I've known people who suffer from addictions, and after one exorcism, it's broken. Literally, the craving is completely broken, and their sleeping patterns immediately return. So that's one of the signs. Not everybody who has an addiction is possessed or obsessed. Those who constantly go to extremes, as in penitential exercises or apostolic activity, or neglecting their primary obligations to do some personal chosen work. Very often you see this. Once in a while you get somebody who's, they're actually demonically influenced because the demons will cause them to neglect their state in life. That is, their duties at home or at work in order to do something at church. That has to be very careful. Not that you shouldn't do things at church, but it just has to be taken into consideration in relationship to your duties according to your state in life. Despair, lack of confidence, and discouragement, a chronic characteristic that alternates with presumption, vain security, and unfounded optimism. Disobedience and hardness of heart, an impatience and suffering and stubborn resentment, uncontrolled passions and strong inclinations to sensuality, usually under the guise of mystical union. Hypocrisy, simulation. Simulation is when you do things that are fake or false in order to deceive people. And duplicity. Excessive attachment to sensible consolations, particularly in the practice of prayer. That is one of the quickest ways to become demonically influenced. And this is a big problem with modernism today. Yeah. Excessive attachment to sensible consolations. Now, here's the problem. The problem with sensible consolations is they occur in spot, which means demons can mimic it. Which is why you don't pay any attention to them, except insofar as if you get a consolation, use it to advance yourself towards God more. But you don't make it the mainstay. It is not the basis of judgment of where you're at in your spiritual life. Why? Well, I'm sorry, but the first thing that God does with people that he likes is he makes their life miserable. And that's because he has to purify them because they've got problems. And the purification process is painful, not because of God, as Jonathan Cross says, but because of something on our part. That usually means that there comes a certain, we're not animals in a certain sense. Well, we're rational animals, but we're, kind of like animals. If you want the dog to do the trick, you give him the bone. You roll him over, you give him the bone. You roll him over, you give him the bone. And then eventually you show the bone when he rolls over, right? Mm-hmm. And then eventually you just don't even show the bone, you tell him roll over and he rolls over. That's what God has to do with us. So what does he do? Sensible consolation to the bone. He throws us these bones. He gets us to do this. It's a consolation, a lot of spiritual consolation is just a sign you're in the beginning stages of your spiritual life. It's not a sign that you've advanced. And then what happens is there comes a certain point where it gets stricter. Then one time a seminarian came to me and he says, before I came here, I used to love going to the chapel. I loved getting up and making vigils and things like that. As soon as I got to the seminary, I want to get out of bed. I can't stand it. I'm like, dude, God is stripping you of it because he has to purify your will. He wants you to do these things because you love him, not because you're getting the sensible cookie out of it. Now, because demons can act upon that, if people are making the sensible consolations the mainstay of their judgment of their spiritual life, they can get drugged all over the map and drugged into all sorts of the wrong areas because it feels good. This is the biggest problem with modernism. The foundational principle of modernism is judgment of spiritual things based upon self. How I feel about it, how I look about it, how I judge about it, how I. The minute that happens, it's going to destroy people's spiritual lives because they will not be doing mortification, penance, and things of that sort. It also destroys charity. because charity doesn't always come with warm fuzzies. Very often charity is something born in pain. So this is one of the reasons why people have to be really careful about that. Then there is also a lack of a deep devotion to Jesus and Mary, an abhorrence for things that are holy and spiritual is very often a sign of demonic influence. A scrupulous adherence to the letter of the law and a fanatical zeal in promoting a cause. This is characteristic readily opens the door to diabolic influence in reformers and demagogues. Now, that kind of comes with kind of an interesting thing. Because if you read some of the things about Martin Luther's life, the guy was obviously diabolically influenced in certain aspects. So those are the signs, those are the kinds, and those are the signs. Tomorrow, I'm going to talk about how you keep these things at bay, and if you become influenced, how you get rid of them. Okay? Because not everybody who has these problems has to go to an exorcist. Okay? And it's important to know, too, because there are certain things that priests can do without being a designated exorcist. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
ADD. You mentioned bipolar. ADD. How would that really?
Well, ADD can be caused by three things. It's actually in my book. It can be caused from physiological indisposition. I had a friend when I came up. The kid was just extremely hyperactive, and all his other brothers were normal, but he was extremely hyperactive, and it's just a physiological disposition he has. The guy hardly sleeps. He just eats constantly. He spins around. It's just his physiological constitution. It can also be caused through certain psychological things by something that gives you repeated and rapid images. Watching TV. It gives you constant and rapid images, and so what happens is your faculties become habituated to those rapid images. So as soon as you step out from behind that, your faculties are habituated to having those rapid images, and when you don't get it, the faculties are like, there's something wrong here, and so the person gets fidgety. So that's one of the things I tell people, if you're going to watch TV, there's nothing wrong with watching TV, but it has to be moderated. The second thing, and the last one, is it can be from a demonic cause. And not all of it is. In kids, my experience is that most of it's not demonic. Even though they'll bring the kid and they say, would you exercise this kid? And I'm like, well, that's not really the problem. It's usually too much TV, too much time in front of the computer, too many video games, that sort of thing. Not because these things are evil, but simply because they're unmoderated and people aren't being careful with them. Yeah.
You repeat the question. On the audio,
I'm sorry?
Are you going to put any of your books into an audio format someday?
A lot of it actually is on my website. So you can actually go to my website. Well, it's a Latin word. It's Latin phrase, censustrationis.org. If you can get that, you're pretty good.
I don't know how to spell that.
Yeah, well, what I'll do is I'll make sure that a card or something is put in the back with that. And so much of the stuff that's in my book is actually on there. Some of the things I'm dealing with in these conferences, I'm giving them in other places that are being recorded. And so they will be available on the internet eventually. Yes?
Father, there seems to be an increase in autism in children, and also Asperger's.
Yeah.
What about those?
They can be, but I don't think most of those are. I think those are more physiological based. My own impression is that the autism, even though some states say it is, some states say it is, but I don't think most of that's from vaccines. It's the mercury in the vaccines is the problem.
And also, I teach in a Catholic middle school, and the kids are reading Harry Potter, and there's a new set of books out called Twilight.
Yes.
And I have told my kids when we go to confession that they need to confess that they've been reading Harry Potter. And they come back and tell me that the priest said that was okay for us to read it.
Yeah.
So what would you recommend for teachers and parents? How do you direct their kids away from that?
No, what I told people become possessed as a result of reading and being involved in it. The other thing is, too, is that if you read Father Amorth, I think he has he's the head exorcist in Rome, he has some stuff on the internet talking about Harry Potter, where he tells people don't get involved in it and stay away from it. So, the irony of it is that people will listen to an exorcist because they realize what this guy does or stuff is kind of weird. And if you just tell people, look, this is what happens if people get involved with it, usually very often they'll stay away from it, unless the person has an inordinate attachment to it. The book's Twilight, I usually tell people to try and avoid for different reasons, which I would be happy to discuss with you if you want to come up and talk to me privately this morning. It has more to do along the lines of I don't really think people should be filling their kids' heads with romantic mush when they're not in a state in which they can really adequately deal with it. That's really the problem I see with it more than anything else. But again, I haven't read this stuff. Yes.
Father, Pope Leo XIII put out an exorcism prayer toward the end of the 19th century.
Right.
That is being circulated now, given to priests that people can do that. Is
Right.
that allowed?
Yes, a priest can use that prayer without faculties.
Yeah. Over a person?
Yes.
Over a person?
Over a person.
A priest can do that?
Yes, he can, and this is something I've investigated so many different times only because I just wanted to make sure that when Rome said the priest could not use that in canon law, when canon law says that they cannot exorcise a person without faculties, that pertains to what's called chapter 2. That's the formal rite of exorcism, not a private exorcism, which can make use of that chapter, or that prayer, that St. Michael prayer is what it's sometimes called. So priests can use that over people and over things without faculties, and usually that's one of the things I tell people, when you have somebody who comes into confession year after year after year, you just cannot break a particular sin, just say, look, I have a blessing, come in, I'll give it to you, and it will help in this regard. And very often, if they receive it over the course of a few months, it breaks it. So recidivism can easily be broken that way. Lay people cannot say that prayer. I know it's on the internet, they tell people to say it, but the Vatican is forbidding lay people to say that prayer, and with reasons of justification. By being a priest, there's certain protection just by virtue of being a priest. The church protects you, and the priesthood itself is a certain level of protection. I've known people that have used that prayer who weren't priests, and they got just beat around spiritually. So I tell people to stay, there's other prayers you can say, the normal prayer to St. Michael, which is that little short one, but you can't say that long one, which was limited by Leo XIII. So, yeah.
There's one of the different ways that parents can curse their children. Is it actually something demonic, or can they just kind of have a grudge or a hatred, or?
It's usually it's not just the feeling. It has to be something they do or say, like, I curse you, or I wish I never had you, or something like that, or you were an unwanted pregnancy, or something like that.
Right. So that's a curse.
Yeah. So those kinds, or you just curse the person, may God damn you. That would be an example of it. So if that's occurs very often, or God curses you, that can cause it.
So,
Yeah.
I was, being a member of a fraternity or a secret society, is that,
Yeah.
receive a curse?
Yeah, whether the question is whether being a member of a secret society or something of that sort, a secret fraternity will be actually come under demonic influence. The answer is yes. There's a set of prayers which I have, which very often I pass to priests, which people will that if they have been demonically influenced, and there's a few kinds of demons I need to talk about tomorrow called generation spirits. But basically, a generation spirit is one which can be passed on from parent to kid. And so if a father gets involved in say, Freemasonry, it can cause a child to have demonic influence. And there's a set of prayers which I give often to priests, and they'll, like if someone they're having problems, and it's obviously they have some kind of demonic influence, one of the questions I'll ask is, there been Freemason in your past history? If there is, and I say, take this set of prayers and say them. And very often that'll break it. So, because too, there's certain things that they do that are, at the highest levels, Freemasonry is just Satanism. So, even though they try to portray themselves as a brotherly and fraternal order, it's anything but, ultimately. So, yes.
Does holy water help protect your house from diseases?
Yeah, the stuff that protects and wards them off, we'll talk about a number of those tomorrow. So there's a whole lot of things that a lot of Catholics don't know much about. So, yes.
So, on the national level, there's someone like Jeremiah versus this country. What effect does that have on the nation, and what would be prevented?
Well, usually, in order for the curse to have some effect, there usually has to be some form of authority you enjoy in relationship with it. Usually, not always, but usually. So if he doesn't have any real authority over it, it's not going to probably have much of an effect. And most of those kinds of things, guys think he's too big for his britches, really. He's not. But there are cases in which, though, where an example of authority who are men, who are Freemasons, who are in charge of setting up a state, and they'll actually do certain things to curse the state. And so the state will have, particular chronic problems in areas. And that can be broken. And there's a tomorrow I'm going to talk about, so if I don't start off with it, somebody remind me. But I'm going to talk about things like demons of the air and that type of thing, and you begin to realize that even when people use vulgarity, you can empower demons to take possession of air. Now, this is going to have a significance. I'll explain what that actually means. It's actually, demons of the air are mentioned in Scripture. They're mentioned by Our Lady of La Salette. They're mentioned in a number of different places. But they can actually curse certain places. But bishops can do the opposite. They can actually bless a particular place to keep demonic influence out. So, in fact, very often what will happen is it's very common if there's a witch living in a particular neighborhood, there's an exorcism which a priest can do where he actually exorcises and blesses a particular house, but everything also within 100 yards of it. If the witch is living within that, immediately the effect is a witchcraft doesn't have any effect. She'll know it right off the bat. She'll have to leave because she realizes it doesn't work anymore. But the point being is that bishops and priests and that type of thing can actually bless houses. They should be blessing people's houses regularly and that type of thing to keep this type of thing. Again, not because Satan's under every rock, but that's one of the principal failings of spiritual fathers to protect their spiritual children from demonic. They might provide the sacraments, they may do all these things. Very often they'll find, I'm providing confession for these people, I'm blessing them, I'm doing all these things, but it's not having this effect. You say, well, are you getting rid of the demonic stuff? I mean, if you're not getting rid of that, you're only providing half the effect. That also brings up the fact that the principal function of the head of the household is to provide and protect. That's the principal function of a man, to provide and protect, not just physically and financially, but spiritually. He provides by praying, suffering, doing good works, mortification, to merit the graces for those people, for his family, his wife. He protects them by keeping demons out of the house. That failing is categorically the most systematic failing of man across the board, even the best of them. And that's one of the reasons why there was a group called Exhumed Christian Rome, we'll be talking about that tomorrow, was established because guys are failing in that regard. So they're two exorcists established this group so that it would provide protection for families. So anyway, that's stuff we'll talk about more tomorrow. Yes? Yeah, again, you're back to, I don't know if he actually said that or not, it's just something I haven't been able to track down, but again, you're back to the issue of, well, are you going to take the practical experience of people who are dealing with the fallout, or are you going to take it with somebody who's only kind of making an initial assessment of it? And that's really the problem. Most people look at it, it doesn't seem that bad, it's just a piece of fiction. The problem is it's a bit more than that. And that's the real difficulty. There was a group of exorcists that met, and one of the priests that was there, who doesn't really seem to know a whole lot, even though he seems to have a good name, a big name, said, oh yeah, there was nothing with Harry Potter. And this priest that exorcised the 3 kids stood up and just said, that is just absolutely false. And he started telling what happened as a result of this. And as soon as that guy sat down, all the priests clapped, and the other exorcists clapped. They said, yeah, that's been our experience with this thing too. So, yeah.
Well, you mentioned about the charismatic renewal, and you kind of hedged, which gave you the impression that there are aspects of the charismatic renewal that you have no problems with, and you know that both our Holy Father and also John Paul were very supportive of the renewal.
Yeah.
I am really where I'm coming from is I'd like to know what aspects you have the concerns about and why.
The principal things I have concerns about is they're seeking charismatic graces, like speaking in tongues and that type of thing. Let me give you an example of speaking in tongues. There was a guy who he was one of these polyglots, he knew like 30-some languages, and somebody invited him to the charismatic meetings, to interpret what was going on. So he's sitting there, and they start the speaking in tongues, and he just gets up and walks out. And so somebody says, well, why did you leave? He says, well, this particular individual was saying this, he was praising Satan. This particular individual was actually gibberish. This particular, and he went down the litany, and basically what it meant is that certain people were doing things that were disordered. The gift, and two, they very often have a flawed understanding of what these gifts are for. The gift does not say anything about the individual. It's not meant for the individual. It's not meant to fall on the ground and flail around either. It's actually, the charismatic gifts are designed to build up the church. And that means that by building up the church like the apostles had, they could speak the languages in order to communicate to people the gospel. The gift of interpretation isn't just hearing something and saying, I think it means it's not that at all. The person actually understands the language. If you have the gift of interpretation, you have to understand the language and why. Why is the gift of interpretation? Why does St. Paul says you must have somebody interpreting when there's somebody speaking in tongues? Why? Because in the Old Testament, you have to have 2 witnesses to guarantee the authenticity of the message. Well, if the guy really doesn't know, or if it's just going on feeling, by feeling he's saying, I'm sorry, but you're just opening yourself up. So the seeking of those charismatic graces is disorder, it's superstitious, and that's why I tell people to avoid it. Again, because I'm dealing with the fallout of it. There are certain aspects of the charismatic renewal that I think are well-intentioned, though. I think the people generally who are in it try to be good people. I think that people want to lead a better spiritual life. But I tend to think that the charismatic renewal is the product of the collapse of the spiritual life of the church. If the church is providing the devotions and the spiritual means by which people would be finding their spiritual fulfillment,